Tom Aspinall vs. Francis Ngannou would save the UFC.
Francis the Predator Ngannou!
Francis Ngannou's head coach, Eric Nixick, revealed that Ngannou is open to a UFC return, which, if you were paying attention to the UFC's initial split with Francis Ngannou, is absolutely insane news to hear from Francis Ngannou.
Look at the heavyweight division right now, bro. What's going on, right? You got this poor guy in Tom Aspinall who's been holding on to an interim belt for almost 600 days now. Like, what are we doing here? You know, so I'm not saying that Francis is the answer, but it at least adds some more value to your heavyweight division if you go out and get a guy like him and bring him back and, you know, let bygones be bygones. Everybody's making money, everybody's happy, but it gets things moving.
As I've always said, I'll fight anyone, I'll fight anytime, and I'll fight anywhere. Never turn down a fight in my life, never will. The day that I start thinking about turning down fights is the day that I'll retire.
There's recently been some rumors of Francis Ngannou potentially being open to rejoining the UFC and fighting for that heavyweight belt. And with all that's been going on with Jon Jones potentially retiring and not wanting to fight Tom Aspinall, this fight between Tom Aspinall and Francis Ngannou could potentially be a perfect replacement super fight for the Tom Aspinall-Jon Jones fight that we should have gotten a long time ago. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm JuicyMMA. I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. Also be sure to hit that join button for exclusive channel perks. But anyways, let's get into it. Francis Ngannou has had a very interesting career with UFC. Early on, when Francis originally signed with the company, things were great. He was getting KO after KO, putting on extremely impressive performances, and he was starting to make a name for himself at the heavyweight division. And after getting a bunch of wins under his belt, and after slowly moving up the ranks, in 2018, Francis finally got his first title shot against Stipe Miocic. And although that fight didn't necessarily go his way, as he kind of gassed out in that fight and Stipe was able to win via decision, Francis didn't give up at that point, as he then went to look on to go on a little bit of a win streak, get a bunch of finishes under his belt, and all the way in 2021 was when Francis was able to get his second title shot against, once again, Stipe Miocic. And in that fight, it looked like a completely different Francis Ngannou from the first time around. In that fight, Francis was not only able to stop takedowns that Stipe was going for, but he was even able to reverse position and get his own takedowns, while also at the same time Francis's cardio looked to be significantly better the second time around as compared to the first. And in that fight, all those improvements turned out to a vicious KO victory for Francis Ngannou in that second round. And at that point in 2021, Francis Ngannou was the new champion of the heavyweight division. Things were looking great at that point. But unfortunately, after that victory for Ngannou, things started to go a little bit downhill for the UFC's relationship with Francis Ngannou, as there was a little bit of a break between his win over Stipe Miocic and his next fight against Ciryl Gane, as he fought Stipe in March of 2021 and he fought Ciryl Gane in January of 2022. But even besides that, going into that fight against Ciryl Gane, it was pretty obvious that this was going to be the last fight on Francis Ngannou's contract with the company, and the negotiations wasn't necessarily going all that well between the two. Francis Ngannou just wanted significantly more money than the UFC was willing to pay, and at that point going into that fight, it almost seemed as if the UFC would prefer Ciryl Gane to beat Francis Ngannou and just let Francis walk at that point. But of course, as we all know at this point, Francis went into that fight injured. He didn't fight like he normally does. He utilized his improved wrestling a lot more than he typically does, and eventually he was able to find that decision victory over Ciryl Gane and put together his first title defense at the heavyweight division. But unfortunately for Francis Ngannou, the UFC and UFC fans, that's the last time we saw Francis with UFC, as eventually Dana White decided to let Francis Ngannou go. Francis decided to sign with the PFL. He fought once in the PFL, he fought twice in boxing, and that's the last time that we saw Francis Ngannou fight at all. But as I said before, there's recently been some rumors of Francis Ngannou talking about a possible return to the UFC, citing at this point it's been some time since he and the UFC had their issues, and there could possibly be a reunion between the two to help the UFC fill that heavyweight belt issue that they currently have. Because at this point, I think it's pretty clear that Jon Jones is not going to fight Tom Aspinall, and he's most likely not going to fight at all. I think he's going to retire. So if you were going to put together a Tom Aspinall versus Ciryl Gane for the undisputed belt, yes, at that point you could finally move on with Tom Aspinall's career, start to build his stardom a little bit more, progress with his career, which would all be benefits for him and the company. But at the same time, Ciryl Gane versus Tom Aspinall isn't a huge fight, and it's not a fight that's going to sell a lot of pay-per-views, and essentially you're losing one of your biggest fights that you can possibly put on between Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall and replacing it with a fight that's not going to sell all that many pay-per-views. So if you were able to bring back in Francis Ngannou to the equation and do Ngannou versus Tom Aspinall, I actually think that will sell a ton of pay-per-views. It's a legitimate super fight, and I also honestly think it's a better fight than Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall would have ever been. So I think it's a win-win for all sides. Aspinall will get more stardom, will probably make more money. Francis Ngannou will be back in the UFC, probably make a little bit more money, and the UFC will get a huge boost because a lot of the fans, including myself, that were unhappy with the product would get rejuvenated based on an amazing fight like Tom Aspinall versus Francis Ngannou. But now, a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, who do I think would win this hypothetical matchup? Well, in my opinion, I think this is a legitimate 50-50 fight. I think you're talking about clearly the two best heavyweights in all of MMA going up against each other. And I think there are legitimate paths to victory for both of these guys. For Francis Ngannou, I think his boxing will do the talking in this potential matchup. I think for him, he's going to need to land clean with that power that he does possess on Tom. When you look at some of the fights that Tom Aspinall has been in, although they have been very short, although they have been pretty dominant for Tom Aspinall, at the end of the day, he does take some shots and he does take some clean shots. So if Francis Ngannou is able to land on Tom Aspinall clean, there could be a finish right then and there. I think outside of just his boxing ability, another path to victory for Francis is to look to utilize some of that wrestling that he does possess. He does have a tremendous top game, and if he is able to take Tom down and land tremendous ground and pound shots, who knows, maybe he can find a finish from there. And for Tom Aspinall, I think the huge key for him is to look to utilize that speed. Tom against anybody at the heavyweight division is going to be significantly faster than them, maybe outside of Ciryl Gane. But especially when you're talking about Francis Ngannou, who isn't known for his speed, I think there's going to be a huge speed advantage for Tom Aspinall in this matchup. So if Tom is able to utilize that speed, look to utilize those jabs, those right straights, and utilize that tremendous footwork that he does possess while getting in and landing shots and quickly getting out and out of range in order to avoid those counter strikes that Francis may throw his way, I think that's a real path to victory for Tom Aspinall. But overall, if I had to give my official prediction for this matchup, I would be leaning towards Tom Aspinall via finish. I think eventually that speed is going to add up and the shots that he lands on Francis is going to add up, and maybe in round 3 or maybe in round 4, I think Tom Aspinall would be eventually able to find a finish via KO or TKO. But another question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, could this fight even happen? Well, in my opinion, I definitely think it could. I think, as I mentioned before, it's a win-win-win for all parties involved. For Francis Ngannou, he can make it back to the UFC, have some higher level competition, and start to build his brand again and start to make a little bit money along the way. For Tom Aspinall, he can finally move on from Jon Jones, fight a legitimate contender and a legitimate all-time fight against Francis Ngannou. And for the UFC, it would be a huge fight that they can put together. The only roadblock that I can see from stopping this would be Dana White himself. Obviously, Dana and Francis don't have a tremendous relationship, and a lot of times when Dana doesn't have a good relationship with guys, he lets them go and he never wants to re-sign them ever again. So I do think that could be a potential roadblock from this fight happening, but if Dana can get over it, or if Dana can realize that the UFC is going to make a ton of money from this potential fight, I think this fight could actually get made in the near future. But of course, I guess only time will tell what does end up happening if this fight gets made, and even if it does get made, who actually wins this fight. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Francis Ngannou will win, or do you think Tom Aspinall would win this hypothetical matchup? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.